This article is about the 2003 invasion of Iraq. For more information on this particular part of the topic, see Support and Opposition for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This article describes the positions of world governments before the actual initiation of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and not their current positions as they may have changed since then. Background: in 2002, the United States began to campaign for the overthrow of Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein. The United States, under the administration of George W. Bush, argued that Saddam Hussein was a threat to global peace, a vicious tyrant, and a sponsor of international terrorism. Opinion on the war was greatly divided between nations. Some countries felt that the United States failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hussein had an active weapons program. Others felt that Iraq was an insignificant and militarily weak country that was not worth fighting over. Some saw the war as an act of imperialism, and charged that the United States just wanted Iraq's oil. On the other side, supporting countries argued that Saddam Hussein was one of the 20th century's worst despots, and that free countries should be obliged to remove brutal dictators from power. Others felt that Saddam's ties to terror groups were well established, and his weapons programs very real. Although the U.S. has yet to find the location of the WMDs, they did find records of bank transactions from some of Saddam's accounts that paid various suicide bombers' families $25,000 in exchange for their sons' martyrdom. Supporters also argue that the chemical and biological weapons that were believed to be in Saddam's control were shipped to Syria before the engagement, and that the current existence of bio and chemical weapons labs in Iraq are an indication of Saddam's continued desire to produce WMDs. Furthermore, supporters point out that although the U.S. does have oil interests in the Middle East, so do the Islamic terror cells who want to gain control of the oil in an effort to pressure the Western world. Additionally, they argue that the UN rejected the invasion of Iraq because of their involvement in the oil for food scandal, in which UN and Iraqi officials skimmed money to allegedly bribe UN officials. Peter Van Walsum, the former chairman of the Iraq Sanctions Committee from 1999 to 2000, speculated in a recent book that Iraq deliberately divided the UN Security Council by awarding contracts to France, Russia, and China but not the United Kingdom or United States. Coincidentally, it was France and Russia who were leading the opposition to the invasion of Iraq. He also claimed that sanctions were not effective and that the lack of Iraqi cooperation was designed to exacerbate the suffering of his own people. Other allegations included a $400,000 contribution from Sheikh al-Khafiji, and Iraqi-American businessman to produce a film by ex-UN Inspector Scott Ritter discrediting the weapons searches. Scott Ritter points out in his October 19, 2005 interview with Seymour Hersh that the U.S. policy to remove Saddam Hussein from power started with President George H.W. Bush in August 1990. Ritter concludes from public remarks by President George H.W. Bush and U.S. Secretary of State James Baker that the economic sanctions would only be lifted when Saddam Hussein was removed from power. The justification for sanctions was disarmament. The CIA offered the opinion that containing Saddam Hussein for 6 months would result in the collapse of his regime. This policy resulted in the U.S. military invasion and occupation of Iraq. Mr. Hersh, one of the things about your book that's amazing is that it's not only about the Bush administration, and if there are any villains in this book, they include Sandy Berger, who was Clinton's national security advisor, and Madeleine Albright. Another thing that's breathtaking about this book is the amount of new stories and new information. Scott describes in detail and with named sources, basically, a 2 or 3 year run of the American government undercutting the inspection process. In your view, during those years, 91 to 98, particularly the last 3 years, was the United States interested in disarming Iraq? Mr. Ritter: well, the fact of the matter is the United States was never interested in disarming Iraq. The whole Security Council resolution that created the UN weapons inspections and called upon Iraq to disarm was focused on one thing and one thing only, and that as a vehicle for the maintenance of economic sanctions that were imposed in August 1990 linked to the liberation of Kuwait. We liberated Kuwait. I participated in that conflict. And one would think, therefore, the sanctions should be lifted. The United States needed to find a vehicle to continue to contain Saddam because the CIA said all we have to do is wait 6 months and Saddam is going to collapse on his own volition. That vehicle is sanctions. They needed a justification. The justification was disarmament. They drafted a Chapter 7 resolution of the United Nations Security Council calling for the disarmament of Iraq and saying in paragraph 14 that if Iraq complies, sanctions will be lifted. Within months of this resolution being passed and the United States drafted and voted in favor of this resolution within months, the President, George Herbert Walker Bush, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, are saying publicly, not privately, publicly that even if Iraq complies with its obligation to disarm, economic sanctions will be maintained until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power. That is proof positive that disarmament was only useful insofar as it contained through the maintenance of sanctions and facilitated regime change. It was never about disarmament. It was never about getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. It started with George Herbert Walker Bush, and it was a policy continued through 8 years of the Clinton presidency, and then brought us to this current disastrous course of action under the current Bush administration. Varying levels of support. Analysis of the count reveals the complexities in world diplomacy. Some national governments publicly denounced the invasion plan while at the same time accepting U.S. aid earmarked for the war, or providing to the war effort troops, fueling stations, military support, and/or airspace. Some national governments provided only a semblance of support. Some nations originally on the White House list disavowed membership in the coalition. Furthermore, significant opposition to the war exists in segments of the populations and parliaments in many of the supporting nations. Adding to the complications, the Bush administration claimed to have the support of some 15 nations that wished to remain anonymous. This bloc has been dubbed by some the Shadow Coalition, or, sardonically, the Coalition of the Unwilling to be Named. Support can be so different in nature, from armed troops to use of airspace and bases, logistic support, political support, to participation in reconstruction efforts, that it appears to some to be difficult to exclude most countries from the official list, except Iraq for obvious reasons. Israel did not officially support or take part in the Iraq War, according to former State Department official Lawrence Wilkerson, and former CIA agent and Iran expert Robert Baer. Israeli officials warned the Bush administration against invading Iraq, saying that it would destabilize the region and empower the much more dangerous regime in Iran. However, it was reported in the Washington Post that Israel is urging United States officials not to delay a military strike against Iraq's Saddam Hussein. It was also reported in 2002 that Israeli intelligence provided Washington with alarming reports about Iraq's alleged program to develop weapons of mass destruction. According to former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith, Israeli officials did not push their American counterparts to initiate the war in Iraq. In an interview with ENet, Feith stated that, "What you heard from the Israelis was not any kind of advocacy of war with Iraq, and that, you heard from Israeli officials in private discussions was that they were not really focused on Iraq. They were much more focused on Iran." At Washington's behest, Israel did not provide vocal support for the war, as the U.S. government was concerned that Israeli support for a participation in the war would potentially alienate the Arab world. In January 2007, The Forward reported that sometime before March 2003, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon told Bush that Israel would not push one way or the other, for or against an Iraq war. Sharon said that he believed that Iraq was a genuine threat to the Middle East and that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, but explicitly warned Bush that if the U.S. did go to war with Iraq that he should make sure to formulate a viable exit strategy, prepare a counterinsurgency strategy, and should not attempt to impose democracy in the Middle East. One of the sources who provided this information was Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Daniel Ayalon. Israel has also assisted the U.S. military by sharing its expertise on counterinsurgency methods, such as utilizing drones and operating checkpoints. In 2003, the Israeli news magazine, the Haaretz, in TS published story, "White Man's Burden," reported that belief in the war against Iraq was disseminated by 25 or 30 neoconservatives, almost all of them Jewish.